going to conclude our chapter on dietary requirements, and we are going to look at diabetes. Now, diabetes again deserves a lesson on its own because it is very much part of the core. It does overlap with obesity. People who have excessive weight are prone to getting a type of diabetes called type 2 diabetes. And remember, we said obesity has been asked since 2013 on question 1B. So twice diabetes has been asked on a long question. The first time was 2011. Note it was on question 2 on section B. And this is whereby on that particular year, the department replaced, that's the Home Economics Department in the Department of Education, they replaced to the question 2, instead of having a food commodity, they had diabetes and sweeteners, so which will be covering in the food additives chapter. Then literally 10 years later, in 2021, this time on question 4, the core, which is on section C, and it was part B, they asked about diabetes again, and believe it or not, sweeteners were mentioned as well, i.e. the uses of sweeteners in food production. Now, in 2011, the diabetes part of the question was worth 30 marks and the sweeteners was worth 20. And in 2021, the diabetes part of the question was worth 20 marks and the uses of sweeteners in food was worth 10. It was 2 at 5 marks. Right, there are over 300,000 Irish people with diabetes. Many people walking around and they're unaware that they have diabetes until signs or symptoms really make themselves obvious. Right, now what I want to do here is, before we talk about diabetes, we have to have an understanding of how our pancreas works, but particularly a hormone called insulin works. So if you have no biology, this is particularly important for you. Those that do biology as a subject will know this already, but I personally think it's important that I do this. So for the non-biology students, they will have a better understanding of what diabetes is about. So what we're going to do there is just do a quick sketch there of our alimentary canal. So we have our esophagus, our J-shaped bag, which is our stomach. We've got our colon. Now this time I'm going to include another organ, and it's an organ as well as being a gland, and that organ happens to be the pancreas. Now the pancreas is leaf-like in structure. It fits into the first part of the small intestine, which is the duodenum. Now we should have a broken line here because the pancreas is behind the stomach. So I'm not going to draw a continuous line, and then it peeps out the other side and it touches off what's referred to as the spleen. Now there's an opening here which I need to include from the duodenum, and if we write the right colour now we'd be doing well. All right, and running through the length of the pancreas we have the main pancreatic duct. So I'm just going to label that here, but it's important that I include the gap there. I want you to be able to see that what is made in the pancreas can actually move into the duodenum. So we'll take the pancreas out and look at it more carefully. So the pancreas is leaf-like in structure, and as I say, we have a gap here, and running through the length of the pancreas we have what's called the main pancreatic duct, and it branches off into smaller branches. So this is our pancreas, albeit a very rough diagram. Now, there are two types of cells in the pancreas. The first group of cells make up about 97-98% of the pancreas. These are cells that are involved in the production of pancreatic juice, which, if you do biology, you will know contains 3 enzymes. And these cells, the main cells of the pancreas, they're called the pancreatic acini. Now, absolutely, you don't need to know this for home economics, i.e. the diagram, but you must understand what is meant by diabetes, or when we're talking about insulin. You can't just dive in, and I really have a horror of, learning off by heart, unless it's something like lists of sources of food for B1 or B2 or thiamine. But otherwise, you really have to understand what you're learning. So they're the main cells of the pancreas, and they are the pancreatic acini. Then we have other cells in the pancreas, and they make up 1-2%, and they are dotted amongst the pancreatic acini. So they make up much smaller percentage of the pancreas cells, and these are called the islets of Langerhans. Now, islets of Langerhans are described as being endocrine cells. And for those of you that don't know, endocrine cells secrete hormones. And there's one particular hormone that we're going to look at today, and that is the hormone insulin. Now, remember, hormones are proteins. Insulin is a protein. All proteins are protein chains or polypeptide chains. And you're looking at approximately 52 amino acids all linked together to form the protein or the hormone insulin. So there's our pancreas and also our islets of Langerhans. Now, something we should be aware of, and that is these islets of Langerhans, these endocrine cells, they are very, very sensitive to any changes or fluctuations in glucose levels in our blood. So just say, hypothetically, I take in a very rich carbohydrate. I'm just going to write CHO, a carbohydrate rich meal. So I'm going to have a bowl of pasta. Really going wild here. I'm going to have maybe garlic bread. I'm going the whole hog. We're going to have a big chunk of cake after that. The point I want to make is this meal is packed with carbohydrates. As you know from your chapter on carbohydrates, all carbohydrates, particularly disaccharides and polysaccharides, will be broken down during digestion into their basic unit called monosaccharides. And down here in the small intestine, the villi in the small intestine, when we have all of the carbohydrates in their monosaccharide form, down here in the lower part of the small intestine, the monosaccharides will be absorbed into the bloodstream. So a few hours after eating, so we'll say after eating the carbohydrate rich, we'll say a few hours. So a few hours after eating the carbohydrate rich meal, the levels of glucose, particularly, remember that's the most common monosaccharide, levels of glucose in blood are high. I'm just gonna mark that. So once the levels of glucose in our blood are raised, which they are a few hours after eating our carbohydrate rich meal, these cells, the islets of Langerhans, detect that. So I'm going to personalize it. So the islets of Langerhans have detected, oh, the levels of glucose in the blood have gone up. And once they detect that the levels of glucose in the blood have gone up, they respond. And how they respond is the islets of Langerhans secrete the hormone insulin into blood. Hormones are chemical messengers. So once the hormone insulin has been secreted into the blood, the hormone insulin, we said, is a chemical messenger. So there's a chemical message for somewhere in the body, and endocrine cells target specific areas of the body, and that message is for body cells. And the message is, body cells, there's a high level of glucose in the blood at the moment. The message is, absorb this glucose. So the body cells, I'm going to put here in inverted commas, are told to absorb the glucose that is present in blood. Why would the glucose be absorbed by the body cells? Why is insulin, the hormone, telling the body cells to absorb this glucose? For obvious reasons, because the body cells need that glucose for energy. So the body cells do as they're told, and the body cells absorb the glucose. So what happens? The level of glucose in the blood, obviously, it drops. And that is what insulin is supposed to do. Insulin is supposed to lower the levels of glucose in our blood. So just a quick recap there. When we eat carbohydrate-rich foods, they're broken down, digested into basic units called monosaccharides. The most common of those monosaccharides happens to be glucose. A few hours after eating a carbohydrate meal, these monosaccharides are absorbed by villi in the small intestine, and the monosaccharides are absorbed into the blood. The glucose levels in the blood, therefore, go up. There are cells in our pancreas called the islets of Langerhans, very sensitive to any fluctuations of glucose in our blood. So when the levels of glucose in the blood go up, the islets of Langerhans, oh, the glucose levels have gone up, we need to respond. And how they respond, they secrete the hormone insulin into the bloodstream. This insulin is a hormone or a chemical messenger. So the insulin has a message for the body cells. So insulin tells the body cells, the level of glucose in the blood is high, absorb this glucose. The body cells do as they're told, absorb the glucose, and the level of glucose in the blood goes down. And that's basically as simple as it is. However, some people have a malfunctioning pancreas due to, I might add, no fault of their own. And when we talk about diabetes, we want to mention there are different types. And the first type of diabetes is called type 1 diabetes. Now, it can also be called diabetes mellitus. Now, anyone going to study medicine or science, etc., pharmacy, will cover a lot of Latin. Mellitus, and I've no Latin, I might add, mellitus refers to sweet, and we'll see why they call it diabetes mellitus in a minute. Another one we can refer to it is, it's called non-insulin dependent diabetes. Now, some people even call it juvenile diabetes, because usually this type of diabetes occurs in young children. Now, go back to celiac disease. Remember I said to you, celiac disease is an autoimmune disease. For idiopathic, that's an unknown cause. The cells of the lining of the intestine become inflamed because of this enzyme transglutamase, which will cause a chemical to be produced when it reacts with gluten and cause the inflammation. But we don't know why that happens. The same with type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is described as that's its main cause, an autoimmune disease. We don't know why, idiopathic cause, but the person who has the type 1 diabetes, their immune system attacks these islets of Langerhans. And as a result, the islets of Langerhans produce little or no insulin. So the islets of Langerhans produce little or no insulin. Now I've made a mistake there, apologies. So just need to go back here. Insulin dependent. Excuse me there now for that. So we'll come back to that in a second. Sorry about that. These things happen when you are doing in teaching generally. So type 1, now if I'd live class, I'm sure there'd be somebody screaming at me and waving at me there and so on. So type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease. It can happen most likely in young children. Believe it or not, some people even say, some doctors, scientists, etc., there's a belief there that it can be due to a result of a trauma. For example, somebody's in a very bad car accident, a while later, as in months later, they suddenly have type 1 diabetes. But generally speaking, juvenile diabetes, young children, could be the age of 10 and up to that age, they weren't diabetic. And now because of this autoimmune disease, their immune system attacks their islets of Langerhans, and the islets of Langerhans produce little or no insulin. And as a result then, the following happens. So just imagine we go back. The child is not aware, the parents are not aware that their child has type 1 diabetes or insulin dependent diabetes. So they continue to eat carbohydrate rich foods. There's nothing wrong with their digestive system. So the carbohydrates are broken down into monosaccharides. A few hours later, the levels of glucose in the blood are high. The norm would be that the islets of Langerhans would respond to this high level of glucose and secrete insulin. But they have type 1 diabetes. And as a result, the islets of Langerhans are not working properly. The hormone insulin, little or none, is produced. If there's no insulin, there will be no message. And if there's no message, the body cells will not be told to absorb glucose. So logic would say, if the body cells don't absorb the glucose that's in the blood, well then the glucose remains in the blood. And this is what we call hyperglycemia, high levels of glucose in the blood. Revision. Glucose happens to be water soluble, and therefore water soluble substances we know cannot be stored in the body. So what will happen is the glucose can't stay in the blood, it ends up being passed out into the urine. And that's the first test normally for diabetes type 1, is to take a prick test where the blood levels are checked to see if the glucose levels are high. But another one then would be to take a sample of urine, and if the levels of sugar are high in the urine, possibly the person has diabetes, and thus the name diabetes mellitus. So what is the treatment for type 1 diabetes? They are insulin dependent. If their body is not producing insulin, they must either use an insulin pen and inject that insulin directly into their bloodstream, say usually around the tummy region. But I know that there are pumps available now whereby the insulin is automatically released into the bloodstream. It's placed under the arm and it's released automatically. But that isn't as common now as the insulin pen, where the patient injects the insulin directly into their bloodstream. So what are the symptoms? So we just highlight there type 1 insulin dependent. So insulin, we know when we eat carbohydrate rich meal, We know that digestion takes place, the level of glucose in the blood rises as the glucose is absorbed into the villi. The rise in the level of glucose is detected by the cells in the pancreas called the islets of Langerhans. These cells respond by secreting insulin directly into the bloodstream. The insulin has a message for the body cells to absorb the glucose, so the level of glucose in the blood drops. With type 1 or insulin dependent diabetes, we said the main cause is autoimmune disease. For no apparent reason, idiopathic cause, the islets of Langerhans produce little or no insulin, and as a result you have fatigue because of the fact we said the glucose is secreted out of the body in the urine. So the body cells haven't absorbed the glucose, so you're tired. Trouble seeing. This is because at the back of the optic nerve, glucose levels build up. Some people lose weight because, or not, I should say, a lot of people will lose weight because the glucose is not being retained by the body, and hungry or thirsty because your source of energy, your sugars, are being lost in your urine. Insulin pen or an insulin pump, but we'll stick with the insulin pen. We're not expected to be up there with all of the changes in medicine. We are only home economics students, and usually a few times a day. Now, the second type of diabetes is called insulin resistant diabetes, or type 2. So whereas with type 1, this autoimmune disease, you don't have control over it. It's just basically hard luck. And it usually develops during childhood, but like that, it can develop at a later stage. With the type 2, when I started teaching first, we used to call, and that's a long time ago, or when I was teaching about diabetes, we would have called type 2 diabetes mature onset diabetes. And I would have said to students, usually people who are 45 years or older get it. And it's after years and years of eating sugary foods, etc. Unfortunately, we can't call type 2 diabetes mature onset diabetes anymore. Sad to say, there are children as young as 8, 9 and 10 with type 2 diabetes, mainly because diet and lifestyle have changed dramatically, but particularly diet. Like years ago when children were younger, a sweet was literally a sweet treat. You got it now and again. Today, in a lot of cases, children have access to sweet, sugary foods, highly processed carbohydrate foods, refined starch on a daily basis. And I'm simplifying this greatly, I might add. If you are eating sugary foods from an age as young as 2, every time you eat sugary foods, the poor old pancreas has to respond. The islets of Langerhans have to secrete insulin. And by the time the child gets to the age of 10, pancreas is there. Hold on here. I wasn't designed for this. The pancreas is extremely overworked. But what will actually happen is the insulin will still be secreted by the pancreas with type 2 diabetes. But what will happen is the body cells will say, hold on here, not responding, not listening. So the message is still sent out. Body cells absorb glucose. Body cells don't absorb the glucose. They become resistant to this message that insulin is sending out. And like I say, it's all brought on by the person themselves. But in the case of children with diabetes, it's the parents who are responsible for the food or the diet that they're following. So poor lifestyle habits like high sugar, high fat diets where excess weight around the midriff particularly can increase the risk of these body cells becoming resistant to insulin. The islets of Langerhans, this is really important. Key difference between them. Type 1 diabetes, the islets of Langerhans have been attacked by the immune system producing little or no insulin, and it needs to be injected into the body, the insulin. With type 2, the insulin is still being secreted, but the body cells are saying no. They are resistant to that message and do not respond to insulin telling them to absorb. The body cells refuse to absorb the glucose in the bloodstream. Headaches, blurry vision, excessive thirst. To be honest, the symptoms can be treated as similar. So if you learn, I suppose, any 5 of those symptoms, so no 5 symptoms, because they apply to all types of diabetes. So hungry constantly, thirsty. We said that a person might feel trouble seeing because of the glucose building up at the back of the optic nerve, chronic fatigue, weight loss, blurry vision. We've all those mentioned. How do you deal with type 2 diabetes? Change your lifestyle. Now, for years and years, the nutritionists didn't believe you could reverse type 2 diabetes. But if you have recently just become a type 2 diabetic, there's a very, very strict diet you can follow. In fact, we mentioned before about ketosis, where people go on a very, very strict, monitored by a doctor for maybe an 8-week period. Some people, it's too severe on their body, but if they're monitored carefully and go on a very high carbohydrate or very high protein, low carbohydrate diet, low fat diet, extreme weight loss over those few weeks. But if it's monitored, you can actually reverse it. So it's not advisable though without medical supervision. A high fibre, low sugar, low fat diet and increase exercise. Now, the other thing I need to mention, of course, is the fact that people who have type 1 diabetes or even type 2, they really do have to manage their diet very carefully and manage their diabetes, because long term, if you don't manage it, the blurry vision can end up with sight loss. And some diabetics, if they don't manage their diabetes, could actually go blind. The other thing we should note is the circulatory system of a diabetic is not the same as someone who's not a diabetic. And as a result, if there's cuts or open wounds, even something as simple as an ingrown toenail with someone that has diabetes, that can end up, there's no circulation going to the toes. And what can happen then is gangrene can set in, and there could be amputation of toes, of feet, legs, etc. It's very severe. So we'll just move towards the end of the chapter here. Sorry that it's down here at the end. So this would be important. Asked both in 2011 on question 2b and again in 2021 on question 4 and the core. They wanted the specific dietary requirements for diabetes. So eat regular meals with a starchy food, ideally a low GI, and this will mean that you've got a steady trickle of glucose going into the bloodstream and you avoid these sugar spikes, which will affect the pancreas. Secondly, reduce your overall intake of sugar to avoid sugar spikes. Eat less fatty foods, because if your circulatory system is not good, that means you have to make sure you have a really healthy heart. So avoid high levels of saturated fats so that you don't raise LDL cholesterol and put pressure on your heart. Avoid too much salt in the diet, because that can increase blood pressure. We said to keep within a healthy range of 6 to 9 grams a day. Increased blood pressure can also put pressure on the heart, which we should be aware of. Now we're going to mention one other one here. 5 will be more than adequate. And that is, when you say to students, what do you think? And they would say, oh, have diabetic jam and diabetic sugar. No, no, no. So avoid diabetic foods. Now, These would include diabetic chocolate. I've had students in the past with diabetes, and they would say that their nutritionist, dietitian has told them avoid diabetic chocolate, diabetic jam, for a couple of reasons. One, they are high in sorbitol, which we'll talk about when we do the chapter on food additives, and sorbitol can increase the risk of diarrhea. And then you also note that these diabetic foods are high in kilocalories, which could lead to weight gain, putting pressure on the heart, and so on. So there are 5 dietary requirements. Now, I do need to mention one other type of diabetes, and that is what we call gestational diabetes. Now, gestation is the medical term for pregnancy. Some women, and doctors don't know why, or medics, why this happens. There's a couple of possibilities. They say that if you've had a very large baby in a previous pregnancy, or if you are extremely overweight before your pregnancy, before the baby is conceived, or if you were maybe a pre-diabetic before pregnancy, you are maybe more prone. But to be honest, they don't know why people can get diabetes during pregnancy. Normally what happens then, once the pregnancy is over, the blood sugars go back to normal, but it's really important that it's monitored. Now, there is a diabetes test that you'll get in a clinic, a prenatal clinic, and it's usually the second trimester, the second 3 months, so between 3 and 6 months, that it's tested for diabetes. And the other thing is, there could be complications if you have gestational diabetes. You could end up with the baby being very large, but also you could end up with an increase in blood pressure. And if your blood pressure is very high, this can result in a very dangerous complication called preeclampsia during pregnancy. And there would usually be an emergency cesarean in a situation like that with gestational diabetes. So it develops during pregnancy if the mother cannot produce enough insulin to meet the extra needs in pregnancy. If untreated, the baby can grow very large, which is called macrosomia, and then the baby supposedly is predisposed to diabetes in later life. Usually disappears after birth. And the best way, again, to treat gestational diabetes is to observe a high fibre, low sugar diet, low in fat, and plenty of exercise, and ideally be at a healthy weight before pregnancy.